All right, well, hello, and sorry for that delay. Welcome to KQED's Teach Do Now webinar in partnership with Educator Innovator. It's Monday, July 14th, and today we'll be talking about connected learning principles to advance 21st century learning. I'm your host, Matt Williams, educational technologist at KQED, the Bay Area Public Media Station, and I'm thrilled to kick off this course with such amazing guests. But before I introduce everyone, I'd like to take a second to explain this webinar in relation to the course and what you should expect during the week ahead. Teach Do Now is an online course open to anyone, but targeted for teachers who are interested in learning about how to integrate social media and 21st century learning approaches to their teaching practice. This course is designed to present these ideas using tools like Twitter and Google+, so that participants can experience their learning in action. During these 6 weeks, we will present a framework for learning where weekly topics are introduced through our Monday webinars. Participants are encouraged to participate with questions and comments during the webinar. You can even watch the webinar archive video later in the week and share comments. You can also go deeper into conversation through our weekly Do Now prompts, where we provide useful resources to help steer the remainder of the weekly conversation, which are on the Teach Do Now blog. Unlike traditional face-to-face courses or even many online courses, this course is happening at any time, anywhere for you, the participant, to share your ideas, reply to others, ask questions, and be present when the time is right for you. We all come to this course with vastly different backgrounds and knowledge of social media, either personally or professionally, and we want this environment to embrace the diversity of our participants' knowledge. Just remember to use the hashtag #TeachDoNow so people can see your comments. And a great way to see all of the comments is on our tag board at tagboard.com/teachdnow, which pulls comments from Twitter and Google+. All the resources for discussion can be found on the Teach Do Now blog at www.kqed.org/teachdonow. Today, our guests are Antero Garcia, Nicole Mira, Terry Hike, and Paul O, who will be co-moderating with me. I'd like to give them a chance to briefly introduce themselves, so Antero, why don't you go ahead and begin?
Thanks, Matt. Hi, everybody. My name is Antero Garcia. I'm an assistant professor at Colorado State University. That about covers it for now.
Great, thank you, Antero. Nicole, why don't you go ahead?
Hi, everybody. I'm Nicole Mira. I've taught high school English in both New York City and Los Angeles, and I'm currently a postdoctoral scholar at UCLA's Graduate School of Education, where I study the intersection of critical literacy and civic engagement. And I also help run a youth civic engagement program called the UCLA Council of Youth Research. So I just wanted to give you a little more information than Antero did.
Thank you, that was really helpful. I'll have to bug you, Antero, a little bit later about some more personal information. Paul, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Paul O. I'm a senior program associate at the National Writing Project. We're based in Berkeley. We have local affiliates at colleges and universities around the country. We work with K through university educators and are, in fact, a network made up of K through university educators. I work in particular on many of our digital literacy initiatives, and one of the projects that I'm involved with has been a working group collaboration between KQED's Do Now and a number of National Writing Project teachers. So thanks for inviting me onto this.
Awesome, thank you, Paul. And Terry, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure, my name is Terry Hike. I am a former classroom teacher. I taught high school English, and now I'm director at Teach Thought. And I'm really interested in how people think and teach and learn.
Awesome. So to those watching live right now, we welcome your comments via the Teach Do Now hashtag on Twitter or the Google+ page, or you can go ahead and log into the chat window on the Innovator Educator website and add your comments there. Excuse me, Educator Innovator. We'll look for your questions and we can address them here during the webinar. We begin our second week of the course on the topic of connected learning. There have been a lot of publications and conversation about how a young person's learning includes so much more than what happens in school. Kids are learning everywhere. Today, the traditional school forms a single, albeit important node in a larger learning environment, and the model of connected learning acknowledges this shift in where students learn, how they learn, who they learn from, and how they express that learning. I want to ask Antero to begin, and perhaps Nicole to chime in, and tell us, can you describe a little bit about connected learning and how it came about and what the framework is?
Sure. So I think the way we're going to be using connected learning for a large part of today's conversation stems from what came out of the Digital Media and Learning Initiative funded by the MacArthur Foundation. And it really is if you look up their infographic, it's this intersection of a bunch of really busy circles, right? It's a Venn diagram that really looks at how peer learning comes together with interest learning and academic learning. And what does that intersection look like? From a very basic perspective, to me, connected learning really is about how can young people, for the most part, take up interests that take up topics that they're interested in, and funnel them through academic forms of learning on their own. Right? This is learning that emerges naturally, and emerges in various kinds of learning ecologies, both online and offline. We tend to privilege digital environments since that seems to be what's new and shiny. As one of our friends, Bud the teacher, Bud Hunt, tends to talk about, right, the shiny thing. But connected learning doesn't have to be about digital things on Google Hangouts that go on and offline. It can be in any kind of context. And so, to me, like an example of connected learning could be something like my interest in young adult literature, for example. I teach courses at Colorado State on young adult literature, like John Green and Harry Potter and Twilight, and what teenagers are reading, right? And the way we read that book, these books today, isn't just about consuming popular authors, right? It's much more about how can we use these as platforms for engagement and learning, right? Fan fiction, civic engagement through the Harry Potter Alliance, for example, or the Odds in Our Favor, an activist group around the Hunger Games. These are all opportunities and platforms for people to network and engage in new and more complex forms of learning. I'd say that in general, connected learning tends to focus on kids and tends to focus on what kids do outside of school, as Matt mentioned. But I do think we need to expand what we consider connected learning to what adults do, right? We're all engaged in our own interests, and maybe it's your knitting circle. Are there knitting circles today in 2014? I don't know. Maybe that's a bad example. There's Ravelry, right? So there's digital knitting circles. Or maybe it's your interest in video games, or maybe it's board games, or auto mechanics, maybe a car knitting circle or something like that. But whatever your interest is as an adult, we engage in these same forms of connected learning. And I think as teachers, as educators, this is a space for us to think about how connected learning privileges the kinds of work we do in classroom. Nicole, do you want to help untangle some of the knitting quagmire I've gotten us into?
The knitting puns continue. Yeah, I think one thing that I know that as a teacher, I was always a little bit intimidated when I'd hear about new models of teaching and learning, because oftentimes they sound so amazingly self-contained, as if you have to throw out everything you've ever done in your classroom and take on this whole new model. But I think what's important about connected learning is that it really isn't anything different than what most of us as teachers kind of think of as best practices. I think we all want our students to start their learning from a place where they are interested and from what their passions are, because we know that that helps students learn better. We want to be able to combine academic learning with peer-supported learning so that students are helping each other in the learning process. So really, connected learning sounds a little bit intimidating when you first hear it, if it sounds like a new model to you, but I think what's really important is that it's taking kind of everything, it's just helping us to kind of shift our mindset in a way to think about how we can use digital media as just another tool in our toolbox to help do the thing that we always want to do with our students anyway, which is make them feel connected to each other and to the broader world in which they're living, because they're about to become and already are citizens in that world. So I think that that's kind of the way I like to think about it, so that teachers can see that many of us already have ways that our lessons are connected, and this is just helping us to think about it a little bit further and take it to the next level.
Great. And then,
I'm sorry, Matt. I was wondering if I could just jump in really quickly and say that when I think of connected learning as well and how it's relevant today and for this conversation, I think a lot about the work that happens in Do Now and the work that many young people we see engage in, and that's a lot of media making and a lot of production-centered kind of work. And I think this notion of leveraging and honoring and really engaging young people in making and creating is a huge part of connected learning, based on, of course, interests and through collaboration with peers, as Nicole and Antero talked about. But that's one thing that I want to focus on that I think has particular relevance, based on this Do Now conversation, as well as the shared purpose that is a part of connected learning that manifests itself in Do Now through the civic engagement kind of practices. One other thing that I would say, just to build as well up on what Nicole and Antero talked about, is that I've heard some of the people who are involved really intimately in this work talk about the fact that connected learning as a set of design principles, as a way to think about how you might structure your own space or the collaborations that you engage in with out-of-school groups, in your classroom space if you're a classroom teacher. That has been helpful for me to think of these as a set of design principles. Versus, I think often, we get educational models and they're presented to us as, a set of standards by which we have to adhere, or to which we have to adhere. So I think that's really helpful, and as well, I've heard people talk about connected learning as really being something built on some of the educational philosophies that I think many of us would be familiar with. Principles that Dewey put forward, but yet powered for this openly networked, digitally powered age. So to the extent that that's helpful, I feel like at least it's been helpful for me to think in those terms.
That's great. Maybe Antero and Nicole, can you kind of spell out a little bit of the connected learning principles that for the framework and what that entails?
Sure. So again, I mentioned I can use my cheat sheet so I don't mess these up. But the peer, right? Peer-supported learning, right? So working with your peers at whatever age group that may be. Interest-driven. So what are the specific topics that you're interested in? Academic, right? So that intersection with the traditional forms of functional literacies that we think about. Openly networked, right? And so what does this look like in online environments and offline environments, and what do networks mean? What do they offer for individuals? I've totally just lost my spot.
Production center, which means that instead of thinking about young people simply absorbing knowledge, it's about what they can produce. So we often think about young people as simply receptacles of information or passive viewers of information, but connected learning really pushes us to think about what they actually can produce to bring new knowledge into the world. And the final one, which I think a lot of us have already started to bring up, is this idea of shared purpose. And for me and for Antero and for a lot of us here in the room, I know that purpose is not simply about college and career readiness, although those are both very, very important, but it's about taking it to the next level and thinking about civic engagement as a purpose for young people, so that they're able to critically analyze and the world around them and then take civic action in order to make their voice be heard. And I think that shared purpose piece is really the linchpin that brings it all together, and that makes digital tools really important, because it's a way that young people can actually speak to an audience of their peers and the public beyond the classroom setting, beyond just the other students in the class and the teacher. They can really speak to a larger environment. Very
cool. So Terry, you've written, in Teach Thought, one of the sort of sayings is, how can learning be better, essentially. So how do you sort of see these types of principles in improving that kind of landscape, perhaps for students?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of potential, but I think I would probably start my answer by talking about the noble sort of hubris of public education in general that's taken on this mantle of taking in every kid in a compulsory model, I guess, of education where everybody, no matter your socioeconomic background, your literacy level, we're going to bring in any kid at any time for any reason, no matter their language and background knowledge and scheme and all this. We're going to take them all in and we're going to make them master this index set of standards. And we're going to make sure that no child is left behind in that process. Every kid, every day, will be proficient on every standard, and that's really great. But I think that it's left us a little bit. It's left each student a little bit, I guess you could say, dangerously anonymous, where we think in terms of proficiency in standards, instead of the native context that really motivates students. And so I think any answer that I would give there would really start with it really has an opportunity to recenter the student at the center of the learning process.
Very cool. I'm curious because as we sort of move away, or move towards a more open landscape, I'm wondering what the role of schools become in this new sort of form. Is, you know, teachers trying to sort of continue to implement certain learning goals and standards. How does this sort of opening sort of change their role and the school's role?
Yeah, well, traditionally, the phrase is moving from the sage on stage to the guide on the side, and I think that's a pretty good starting point for understanding it. But I think that's a little too iterative. If you want to think in more transformative terms, we might, you know, for a moment anyway, be a little ideological and think, all right, so what should a school do? What should a school be? If you want to harken back to Dewey and what he would think about things, and you want to talk about civic engagement and citizenship, what should a school do? And then what should a school do, not just for the kids, because we typically think of curriculum and students and performance, academic performance, but what should a school mean to a community? And then if we start thinking backwards from there, we can almost re-empower teachers. So instead of constantly changing and fine-tuning them, you know, rethink things from the bottom up. I think that's really exciting and empowering, because teachers are still going to need their content expertise. They're still going to need to be, you know, masters of assessment. They're still going to need to be these cognitive coaches. They're still going to need to coach students emotionally. There's always going to be a human element for teaching, because learning itself is, you know, a fundamentally human process.
Interesting. And Taro, how do you feel? Do you think teachers will continue to need to be masters of content as we move forward?
Yeah, I think we need to be facilitators of content, which requires some form of expertise. I struggle with the word mastery in general, right? I think it's tricky if we think about hierarchies in classroom. I do think Terry's right in terms of that relational component for teachers and schools. It's hard to speculate, right, on what schools need to look like or how we need to redesign them. However, I do think we need to acknowledge, I think the elephant in the room is that the schools that we predominantly sit in today, the way they're built, the architecture, the structure, the fact that we have a bell is built on this industrial era, and we're in this post-industrial era of education that we're in today, right? We're in a broken system now, right? So if we acknowledge that, we know that what it should look like is not this. It needs to look fairly different. I've been urged in the invisible chat box that most people can't see to mention that a lot of what Nicole and I have been talking about comes from a free ebook, which we'll put a link to, unless it's already in there in the Educator Innovator chat box, that looks at several examples of what teachers are already doing in classrooms. And I think this is how we create the revolution for schools in connected learning contexts, is to look at what are teachers doing and to think about how are teachers already being empowered, how are teachers using their agency to transform what classrooms look like. And so again, there is a 99-cent version of this book that you can buy on Amazon, but screw it, get the free PDF copy. I don't know why you would buy the other one. I'll throw that up there for now.
We actually linked to the resource on the Do Now prompt for this week as well. But Nicole, did you want to chime in as well?
Yeah, I think that it's what Ontario is starting to mention about the ebook. We thought it was really important to put out a series of real-life classroom examples of teachers putting connected learning into action, because I think there is a little bit of an issue of I don't know if it's defeatism, but there's this issue that somehow, because it's difficult and because a lot of us are teaching in a system that is broken, that we should therefore just kind of not think about classrooms anymore as sites of connected learning. We should just look to the outside the classroom spaces because they're more free and they don't deal with all the constraints of standards and testing and sometimes lack of technology and infrastructure. So it's just easier to go to other places. But I think what this ebook is really important for is to show that while we do have to acknowledge that we need to be working outside the system to kind of change what schools look like, we also at the same time have young people that are in our schools and in our classrooms right now, and that teachers are working within the system at the same time and showing that it is possible. If we acknowledge the barriers, we can overcome them by putting them out there and saying how it is difficult to do connected learning in the classroom because a lot of people don't know what it is or how to do it. If we put that out there, we can then trust teachers to show us ways to overcome those barriers and start to make connected learning more of a norm. So I think that's an important part of the ebook, is showing that this is something that can happen in the classroom despite the challenges, and that we need to be working both within the system and outside the system at the same time to make it work for young people.
Very good. What kind of, you say despite the challenges, what kind of challenges come up in this environment for teachers?
Well, just speaking from personal experience before I let everyone else chime in,
Sure.
I know the school that I taught at last year, when I returned to the classroom after being gone for a few years, a lot of schools do have a zero tolerance policy for electronics. So my school did not allow students to get onto Facebook or Twitter and to a lot of sites that could be used to kind of create openly networked spaces for young people to share their knowledge. And also the infrastructure at the school made it such that the internet usually wasn't working. And if students brought their own devices to get onto the internet, they would be confiscated. So I think there's a lot of work to do around, if we do want to use technology as tools, we have to educate our colleagues and our administrators about the value of how to use these devices. I think a lot of times students are kind of pictured as deviants when it comes to technology. We're afraid they're just going to use it for recreation, or that we have to protect them from the big bad outside world. And I think we do have a responsibility, but we need to see young people as partners in figuring out ways to use technology responsibly instead of just labeling them as kind of kids that don't understand or can't participate in this dangerous world. So that's one challenge. And then, of course, the challenge of simultaneously preparing students for standardized exams while also trying to get through all of the content as part of your pacing plan, and also taking the time that it needs to kind of hang out and mess around and geek out with technology. So I think those are all things that I'm struggling with as I think about connected learning in the classroom.
Great. Paul, did you want to talk a little bit about some of these examples that were mentioned in the ebook in terms of connected learning?
Yeah. And before I do that, I just want to say one quick thing, that I think in terms of thinking about the role of schools in connected learning and the way connected learning looks in classrooms, I wanted to just quickly go back to a point that Antero made, which is that connected learning is essentially happens in many educational spaces. And so I think, an important consideration is that you could engage in these kinds of practices, a production-centered, interest-driven practice in an out-of-school space, or through a whole host of organizations that are not in school. And so one thing that I guess I would say to any of the listeners or viewers is to ask, who within your community. Well, and let me just say that's because, as we know, learning happens all the time and in all kinds of spaces. I mean, that's true for us as adults. It's happening out of school just as much as in school. And so I guess I would challenge listeners and viewers to think about who else in my community, who else can I engage with to develop sort of a more complete ecosystem of learning, of which school is just one part. So I would say that. But then within schools themselves, and in some of the examples in the ebook, which I think are great examples, for instance, Minu Rami, who's going to be a guest on next week's webinar, she has a chapter in which she talks about a zine that her students created as part of this notion of production-centered. There are examples related to interest-driven. Danielle Filipiak, I believe, it focuses on that particular principle, and yet with all of the examples, I think many principles are part of those examples. But in her case, Danielle, as an English teacher, set up a really interesting way in which her students could critically engage with texts over the course of the year. Janelle Bentz focuses on media making with her young people, and so I think there's a rich array of different ways in which you can see connected learning playing out in classrooms in the ebook.
Very cool. Terry, how do you sort of see connected learning principles improving on Common Core standards, for example, and some of these formal assessment mechanisms for learning?
That's an interesting question. I think in some ways the modern classroom is kind of an awkward place because there's a little bit of awkwardness in this idea that students are learning in the shadow of Google and in the shadow of connectivity, where they have more access to more information in their smartphone than the entire school library, times 10. And so there's this awkwardness that they're sitting in the presence of a tremendous amount of potential, and potential for connections, potential for knowledge, potential for action. And I think that in many classrooms they're seeing relatively little of that potential realized. And I don't know if that's what's kind of, if that kind of over the long term decays their motivation, or if that decays their sense of engagement, or whatever terms teachers want to use. But I think there's that awkwardness that, even regardless of what changes the Common Core induces in the classroom or in a school, I think, obviously learning starts and ends with the student, so I think that kind of awkwardness is, I think that's problematic. But I think that there's another kind of awkwardness that's also that also exists in the classroom. When we talk about being connected, the classroom is this place of great connectivity. Every single day, 25 or 35 kids come into a class, come into this space, and get to know each other over the course of 160 or 180 days. And they sit together, and they learn together, and they fail together, and they triumph together, and whatever the case may be. There are these incredible connections every single day in the classroom, but yet they also kind of ring hollow, because I'm not sure if it's because it's an outcomes-based environment that's set up odd, but there's just this awkwardness, I guess. And I think connectivity has this healing potential that can kind of clarify a lot of that awkwardness. So it starts connecting people to networks, and it starts connecting people to reasons to learn. It starts connecting people to one another. It starts giving people more authentic, people meeting students, starts offering students more authentic reasons to learn. That's something that's really missing in those classrooms, is a reason to learn, other than the game of teaching and learning and grading and
Sure.
all that.
Sure, and I think it's very valuable to, like connected learning principles say, to have inquiry and interest-driven learning happen. But just to kind of think about some of the skeptics, perhaps, if what connected learning, how that type of model can still embrace some of the assessments like Common Core. How does that come into place? Is it rigorous enough, or what happens when you're trying to assess students learning from the sort of standards-based model? Nicole, can you address that, perhaps?
Sure, I've been thinking about this a lot. I know we've got teachers listening from all over the country. I'm personally in the California context. So for us, we actually did not have state testing this past spring. I heard from a lot of teachers that this really let them have a time of experimentation, and there was this sense of relief of having some time to actually play with Common Core and get used to it, get used to the standards without having the pressure of a test. So I will say that going into this next school year, I am a little bit nervous. I think it's important to separate the standards from the high-stakes assessment. I have a big problem with the high-stakes assessment in terms of the fact that we don't know how related they'll be to a shared purpose or student interest, and exactly how much critical thinking they're going to ask students to use. So I think that's problematic. But in terms of the standards themselves, I do think that there are openings there for us to bring connected learning and Common Core together. I'm going to try to share my screen for a second and show you guys an example of a Common Core standard and how I think I can see some connections. So can everyone see this standard right here?
Yes.
Okay. So this is part of a Prezi, which, by the way, I gave the link to Matt to share eventually when this webinar goes up. This is a Prezi that I created to help teachers think about how to integrate connected learning into their teaching, and I made it reusable and public, so you can actually take this and show this to anyone you'd like and play with it and remix it. But I was looking at the anchor standards in the Common Core. This is the writing anchor standard number 6, which all students from grades 6 to 12 are going to have to master. So all teachers, especially English teachers, but also teachers across the content areas, have to constantly spiral up through all the grade levels this standard, which is to use technology, including the internet, to produce and publish writing and to interact and collaborate with others. So when I look at that standard, I can see 4 of the 6 connected learning principles in there in some form. So for example, using the internet opens up a possibility of openly networked learning if you allow students to post to the public. When I see producing and publishing, I see examples of production-centered learning that are possible here. Interacting and collaborating, I see students peer supporting, so I see that as a possibility here in Common Core. And obviously this is all academically oriented because these are academic standards. So I think in some ways, while I saw in the chat roll that a lot of folks are really interested in this idea of how we get our administrators on board. I think that eventually, with Common Core, all of us are going to have to be on board to some degree with the principles of connected learning. But I do think what's missing from the Common Core in a lot of the standards are, number one, it never explicitly says anywhere that we need to connect learning to students' interests. All of the Common Core is very much driven by college and career readiness. So I think that's something that we have to inject as teachers into the Common Core, is finding a way to do all of this by starting from what our students are interested in. And also, like we've talked about, this idea of shared purpose. There's nothing explicitly in the Common Core about civic learning. It's something that we have to then go above and beyond what the Common Core calls for to give more of a purpose to our learning. So like Terry was saying, we can actually have that sense of connection in the classroom and have students be excited about their learning.
And if I could jump in,
Yes.
essentially this is a design challenge. So if you think of learning in terms of instructional design, curriculum mapping, in terms of backwards planning, you know, you start backwards from a power standard, for example, and then you look at the standard and you think, well, how can I connect students in pursuit of mastery of the standard? You know, if you think of the standards as ingredients, how can I mix these ingredients together to create a compelling dish that connects students? Or if you think of the standards as building code, these are just general rules. And so that's really a design challenge. It's an instructional design challenge. It's a curriculum mapping challenge. But you know, I don't think it's artificial at all to think, well, can we connect students in pursuit of mastery of academic standards? I think absolutely you can. It just becomes, you just have to squint a little bit. You have to look, you know, at the left, look at the standard and look at the opportunities to connect students and think what's possible.
Very cool. I think, oh, go ahead, Paul. Sorry.
Yeah, so I just wanted to bring up this question that was raised in the chat that we noticed. It had to do with, let's see, I think the question is here, posted in our chat. So I'm talking about the chat at Educator Innovator. Someone asked, would one of the panelists address kids, blogs, comments? I want to do this, but want to hear from others as to how to manage the process to make sure learning, not attention getting, is what's happening. So, Tara, did you want to address that one?
Sure. I think looking back at the standard that Nicole had posted, I think part of how we do this is to think about, you know, what's the goal of doing that? Because again, a blog is just a glorified form of public writing, and I think if we think about what are the actionable steps of why we want young kids to be writing online, I think that's where we take a step to think about it. And again, I'm approaching this thinking about this at the high school level, right? That's the context that I taught in. Didn't tell you my background at the beginning. I used to be a high school teacher also, in a similar region to where Nicole was teaching last year.
You might have to talk about Black Cloud at some point as well.
And we had a black cloud over our school that we turned into a game. That's another story. But I do think. I think part of what we need to do when we think about using blogs and using devices and things where kids could potentially, you know, act in disruptive ways. We have a back channel here where Nicole tries to post silly things to make people laugh as we're talking, and it can be disruptive and rude. And one of the ways that we need to think about that is the responsibility, right? Like, what is the civic identity that I'm trying to convey in these public spaces when I write online? And I think that's one of the framework. It gets trickier when you get to kids who are younger than 13 because of COPA, right? The act that essentially, whenever people sign up for something like Facebook, it says, I'm over 13, right? And that's not because 13 is the age when we've decided that people are mature. It's that 13 is the age when essentially we've decided that kids are old enough to be marketed to, right? And so we can think about how we commingle responsibility online with this role of capitalism. And I think there's some tricky conversations we need to think about for younger kids in that sense. Interestingly enough, one of the books that's written around youth and identity is written by Raffi, the guy who wrote the Beluga song, which is kind of mind-blowing to me. That Raffi wrote a book on youth and online identity. But I do think this is a space for you to really think through, you know, what does it mean for me to do this, right? If I haven't created a trusting environment in the physical space, right, there's definitely not going to be a trusting environment in the digital space, right? I think it comes down to that relational peer-supported form of learning that we're going to expect.
Very cool. Sorry, I was muted. Terry, do you have anything you want to add to what Antero was saying? And you're muted right now as well. Still muted. Terry. Uh-oh. We're all
Sorry.
muted. There we go.
Yeah, when we talk about the ambition of public education and that all the things that educators, schools, teachers, administrators have to manage and be accountable for and watch out for, I think one of the great parts of connected learning is that you're essentially emptying the classroom into an authentic community where there's this visibility that doesn't exist in classrooms. So if something happens in the classroom, it's up to the teacher to notice it, record it, document it, and report it. But in a situation that's authentically connected, and the students are connected to networks, communities, parents, mentoring organizations, leaders, whatever the case may be, these acts and these actions, this civic responsibility or lack of civic responsibility, it should be visible to a broad set of stakeholders. And so I don't know if that's going to make any principal feel better about implementing this in their schools, but the idea is that the burden of learning it really does take a village, and this burden of learning really cannot be supported on classroom teachers' shoulders alone. So this whole thing should empty into a community where everybody can help. So when you have, don't think of it in terms of behavior problems, but when you have neglect, when you have these really challenging issues, it can't be up to the classroom teacher to fix everything and make everything perfect, because really it's so overwhelming to do that, then they just throw out models like this as being problematic. And so I guess that's what I would say is, yeah, there are some problems and challenges, so let's get everybody involved, not just teachers.
You know, and Matt, I would just jump in and quickly say that I think it is, you know, getting kids in online spaces, particularly if they're not used to that in a school context, I think is going to be challenging, and I think it'll be hard to manage. And I think what's critical from my experience is yes, definitely managing it so that, you know, there is a positive learning experience, but also understanding that in some respects, you know, what we're trying to do is we're trying to equip kids over a long period of time, you know, to have the digital citizenship skills that they need to be able to interact with others comfortably in online spaces, so they can engage in the kinds of conversations that, you know, Do Now helps to foster. And so, you know, the earlier I think kids are able to begin to engage in those processes, probably the better over the long term. But it is a difficult, you know, management task, and I think the important thing is to be able to justify why it is that, you know, you're engaging in that kind of task or process with administrators, with parents, with other constituent groups, guardians, you know, who might question, you know, why you are allowing your kids to do X, Y, or Z. And I think, again, that's where something like the connected learning framework, you know, might come in handy. I think as well, you know, when we think about what is our responsibility, not just as educators, but as a community, you know, I feel like it's to prepare our young people to be able to, you know, engage using these tools, if not blogs, but any of these online tools of communication, because we know that that is exactly what they're going to need to be able to do. And I'm not even talking about, you know, job, career, and college readiness, which is, I know, you know, the sort of the buzz terms, but you know, just in terms of what it means to be able to function as an adult, or even, you know, as an older young person. So I think you know, the reality is that these things will be difficult and that, you know, challenging, and we need to be able to provide the rationale for why we engage in these processes.
Great. I'm curious to know, you know, so you're kind of referring to like a lot of some basic digital literacy competencies and using these tools, but where does it go from there? You know, I think that's a very big challenge and something real to, you know, get students to think about the academic and the sort of socially active lens on top of social media and publication and so forth. But where can it go in terms of the sort of the learning and the skills and you know, the rigor in a sense to get students to be more present online and to have that kind of voice. And where can it, and what are the, you know, what are the sort of and where can it go awry in a sense, like how, you know, how can we look at the two different, excuse me, how can we look at that landscape, like where can these sort of skills build That just went awry. Thank you, Antero. Antero, where do you think the sort of, where do we want to build towards? What kind of skills do students need to really, these 21st century skills? What are they essentially, and what do we hope to achieve?
Yeah, I will say, just coming back to the it going awry thing, I think if we don't create the space for things to go awry, right, we play it too safe, right? There needs to be a space for young people to take risks in our classroom, which inherently means as educators we need to be comfortable with the space of risk in our classrooms. And so I think that's a space for us to consider. I think where it goes is we need to think about, by the time students leave our classroom, how are they going to see themselves as being able to enact change upon the world, right? Which sounds very lofty, but I do think it's about, as students think about, I created a blog, but for what? How is my voice amplified? How am I able to be a participant in society? Particularly if we think about in the inner city context I taught in, I had many students who weren't necessarily U.S. citizens, right? And to think about how were they able to have a voice and enact change here within the United States, within the local context of South Central Los Angeles, and within the global context of a network society. I think these are lofty questions that we need to consider. An exercise that I do with my pre-service teachers is we spend part of the semester looking at the Common Core standards. Colorado also uses them. And thinking through, what do these standards mean? How do I structure curriculum around making sure that I'm addressing these standards? How can I speak about them knowledgeably so I can get a job in a school when I finish my teacher preparation program? But at the same time, I ask my students to think about, what are the standards that you want in your classroom, right? How do you design lesson plans that not only address the Common Core standards, but address the standards of why you want to, create the curriculum you do in your classroom? Why is that the most important thing that your students want or your students need? Nicole, do you want to jump in here and add to this?
Yeah, I was thinking about some of the academic skills that also get kind of reinforced through things like blogging and public displays of language, and I think there's a really unique opportunity there to teach students about some of the Common Core skills of revising and working on a piece of writing over a period of time. Because I know for me, the students that I work with in an after-school program have some experience in blogging the research that they've been doing about their schools and their communities. And having it be an open blog where people from the community can comment, students have had a really interesting education in seeing how important their choice of language is because of the ways that different audience members that come to their writing will pick out certain things that they say or certain words that they use and kind of call them out on it. So if they talk about the education that all students deserve, or they talk about their communities, people are going to read their writing and they're going to actually call and make them defend with evidence the claims that they're making. And I think it's a really valuable way so that it's not just a teacher with a red pen going through their writing. They're actually seeing in real life the consequences of your words, and that you will then be held accountable to explain what you have to say. And I think it's a really, it's an academic skill, and it shows students that there is a connection between academic learning and the real world, that when we learn what it means to use logos and ethos and pathos to manipulate and to persuade an audience in our academic writing, that's something we're going to use in our real life when we have a political perspective or something that we want to persuade other people in our community of. So I think it's a powerful way when students see that real people outside of the teacher and outside of the other students in the class have something to say and might have a different opinion and might not express their opinion in such a nice way. That's a learning opportunity, both civically and academically. So I think it's been really powerful to see what blogging and interaction with the public can do.
Paul or Terry, do you have something you want to contribute to that?
Go ahead, Paul.
No, go ahead, Terry. I was going to defer to you. I wasn't sure whether you were having muting issues or not.
Now, well, I think that in some ways learning, I don't know if it's become more dangerously academic than it's been in the past, or if it just seems that way in light of a modern connected social context, but I think connected learning has the ability to authenticate any kind of learning experience. If you think of how students create meaning, even at a neurological level, at a brain level, that meaning comes from schema, and this kind of gelling of background knowledge and scheme that's familiar to them, and then they bring that sort of experience to a classroom, and they use that often really alien stuff to make sense of equally alien stuff, which is academic content. And I think that sort of disconnect there is something that being connected can improve.
Great. Paul, anything from you, or?
You know, I have a lot I could say, but I know we're running short on time, so
Sure.
Yeah.
So I wanted to address just some basic action steps that a teacher can kind of think about in terms of making their classroom more connected and sort of embracing some of the connected learning principles. What do you, Nicole and Tara, what do you guys suggest in terms of, you could talk a little more about the ebook, or what kinds of steps you think are sort of good first pass? Like, this all can be quite overwhelming in terms of being like this facilitator of connecting the whole community to their students. What would you suggest?
Yeah, definitely, I agree. I think that the first step is that we cannot expect to integrate connected learning into our lessons and into our assessments and the projects we do with students until we feel comfortable ourselves as adult learners with what it means to be connected learners. So for me, it really started from becoming more comfortable myself. I mean, to the point of learning what Twitter is, learning all the different things that are out there, and learning how to use them yourself, and finding other communities of like-minded educators just to try something out and be, the idea of connected learning is that it's okay to hang out and mess around, and it's okay if you mess up. And I know that all teachers, we're all very careful with and we plan very carefully the learning experiences we want for our students, and we want everything to go right. So we need to feel comfortable ourselves with what this technology is all about, or whatever connected project we want to try. So I would encourage teachers just to reach out to ask about one resource that maybe you haven't used before, and then when you get into when you feel more comfortable with it, I would try in every unit just maybe try one aspect of, take one principle and really try to think about that principle in that unit. So if interest-driven learning sounds like something that's not too intimidating to you, and you want to learn how to incorporate student interest more into your teaching, I would just think about the next unit that you're going to be teaching, and find one opening where you could get a chance to ask students about the ways they might connect to a certain topic, and then find some way to bring a resource in that builds on that interest. Just little steps until you start to feel more comfortable, and then take advantage of the sites like the National Writing Project's Digital Is resource, which has tons of lesson plans and ideas from other teachers in the classroom to help you kind of take the next step, and just know that you don't have to reinvent the wheel.
Great. And Taro, how about you?
Yeah, I would just highlight that part of what I'm hearing from Nicole is that there's no cookbook for doing connected learning, right? It's not, go and learn Twitter, make sure you've tweeted 20 times, and then make sure your students tweet 10 times, right? You can't distill it down to a single tool or to a single disposition. The other thing I think is important to recognize with connected learning is, particularly as you bring it into a classroom context, you can't institute connected learning it's not a regimented thing where unless you know who your students are and you know them as a community and as a community of learners, you can't engage in connected learning, right? The first step, right? So if there was a cookbook, the first step would be the development of making sure that you have this level of trust and community amongst each other, and from there, hopefully, if you know the students in your classroom, you can build around what their interests are. You should have a sense of who they are and what they're interested in, and build around that, right? Think about how your curriculum coincides with the kinds of interests that your students are interested in, and curriculum should be built organically around those kinds of spaces.
Great. I actually think about Christopher Emden, who's a professor at Teachers College at Columbia University, who wrote this book called Revolutionary Pedagogy, which is really about getting to know your students so well that you can do that kind of linking of curriculum and interests, like you mentioned, Antero. Thanks for that.
And his Twitter chat that he helps moderate around hip hop and education, is a good example of connected learning in a large, engaged audience of educators around the world that regularly participate in that as a conversation. So I think it's a really good example.
Great. Terry, how about you? You want to chime in on the last thoughts?
Yeah, I just wrote down, I've been blogging for too long, so I wrote down 6 tips. One, start with a project. Start with one project, work from there for teachers that are looking to get started with this. 2, add one piece of technology at a time. That may not, if you feel comfortable with more, add more, but as others have said, you don't have to reinvent the wheel, you don't have to It doesn't have to be necessarily transformative right away. 3, connect students to others. You don't have to do everything yourself as a teacher. 4, collaborate with the teacher in your building, that somebody you have access to that wants to head down this pathway with you, and that they can help support you and share the work with you. 5, this is probably the best idea, I think, is ask students for ideas. A lot of times when I'm stuck and I'm not sure what to do and I talk to students, they give me better ideas than I would have come up with on my own. And 6, consider all the other models that are really closely connected learning: project-based learning, scenario-based learning, place-based education, experiential learning, project-based learning. There's a lot of possibilities.
Great. And you said you posted that once on your blog? Or?
No, I can't. But
you
no,
should. That would be a great blog post. Please share that with us.
Yeah.
That'd be awesome. Paul, do you have some last thoughts on getting started, besides having everyone sign up for Do Now?
Yeah, exactly. I would say that I think checking out the ebook that has been referenced here, I think really going to sites like Connected Learning Alliance site, clalliance.org, and really paying attention to what's happening at Educator Innovator, where partners like KQED, I think, are enacting connected learning. I would say that and argue that Do Now is connected learning in action, and connected learning articulated. And I would finally say that there are all kinds of connected learning opportunities happening this summer here in the U.S. and around the country. Around the world. There's work being facilitated by Mozilla. There are maker parties. We at Educator Innovator are hosting all kinds of events, and you can find them all at makesummer.org.
Great. So thank you all very much for that. It's really interesting and insightful. I guess we have about 2 more minutes left in this webinar, so I just want to thank everyone for a great conversation, and that to say that we'll have a full video recording of this webinar available immediately on the Educator Innovator website, as well as kqed.org/teachdonoww, in case you want to watch it again. I know I'm going to. And there will also be other curated content on the way in the next couple of days that you can view and discuss throughout the week. This wraps up our second webinar of the Teach Do Now course, but that doesn't mean our conversations have to pause here. We encourage everyone to keep the energy going by using the Twitter hashtag #TeachDoNow, and by getting involved in the ongoing conversations within the Teach Do Now Google+ community. We've just posted a Do Now prompt that you should look at that looks at connected learning, and you should definitely consider thinking about ways you can address connected learning in your own teaching practice. What school might look like, how you as a teacher can change or evolve your teaching practices in certain ways. Also, mark your calendars for next Monday, July 21st at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern for our 3rd webinar in this series as we explore media making tools for learning. We're almost out of time, like I said, and I just want to take a last minute to thank our guests, Antero, Nicole, Terry, Paul. You guys are awesome rock star educators and thinkers in this field, and we love to connect with you on connected learning. To learn more about Educator Innovator and its network of partners, please check out www.educatorinnovator.org. And for more information about connected learning activities happening this summer, check out www.makesummer.org and follow the Twitter hashtag #MakeSummer. And finally, to those who are interested in joining our Do Now working group this fall, please visit the Do Now website on KQED and apply. And continue to follow us as these weeks continue for Teach Do Now and you learn more about what that is. So thank you so much again, and good night.